And
no, forse sì.
I think we should make a start.
Devi unmute mix. L'hai trovato?
So thank you very much. I think we should make a start, because otherwise we'll sort of run a bit behind with the work for today, and we have a full day ahead of us. So yes, we're streaming online, so that's the update of the morning. We managed to set it up in time. So we'll be streaming online on a YouTube channel, and I've posted the link on the Facebook event for those of you who are on Facebook, but I don't expect anyone to be on Facebook, of course. Welcome to Cambridge, I should say, and welcome to the Department of Politics and International Studies. First of all, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate the generosity and the fact that you all come from very different parts of the world, Europe, Italy, and even the United States in one case. So I'll keep it very, very brief, because as I said, we have a full day ahead of us. Essentially, this conference started very small and it became a lot bigger. Started in the cafe just around the corner here for a chat that Lily and I were having about the new government and the Renzi government and the fact that they were so silent on foreign policy. You know, we haven't really heard a lot about foreign policy. And of course, we realized that the question ran a lot deeper, and it really involved the kind of trajectory of the Italian left, the renewal, the transition, the unfinished kind of transition of the Italian left. And we were asking, and we kept asking questions about, you know, what about the United States? What's the current attitude of the government towards, you know, Europe? What do they want to do in Europe? You know, what about the Atlantic Alliance? But also, what about use of force? You know, what about war? You know, and what about non-state actors, civil society, of course, but also big corporations? How is this going to all play out in the foreign policy of the Italian left? And of course, how does this compare to European cases, to other European cases? So we launched a call for papers, and here we are, really. And it's wonderful to see you all here. I think I need to thank the sponsors, of course. So the Association for the Study of Modern Italy, ASMI, the Cambridge Italian Research Network in Cambridge, of course, Routledge, Taylor and Francis, and of course the Politics and International Studies Department, who've all been very, very generous for filming this conference. I should also make a mention of Lilia Giugni, Davide Martino, and Marta Musso, who are the other organizers of this conference, and without them, of course, we wouldn't really be here. And I think I will leave it at that, just saying that you have all the sort of details on your conference pack. So we will be in this room and in a room upstairs on the first floor. There are signs guiding you to the first floor room. And really, it's just to say enjoy the day, enjoy the conference, and thank you so much again for being here. So we can start with the first panel. I haven't got a problem, of course. But yes, Robert, you can take the floor. And really, it's up to you how you want to organize it. And yes, those of you who are in S1, this is the good time to go. So you take the stairs up, and you will see sort of arrows pointing to S1. Okay, thank you so much. So yeah,
should we get the three panelists?
Yeah. Do you want me to read aloud the names?
No, they know. It's just don't want to knock the camera.
Nope, that's fine. Nej, för sono qua fuori, aspetta.
Okay. Sì, I think three should sit here. Poi troppo YouTube. No, Exactly, yeah. Obviously it'll go up the more you...
Sorry? SG fine. Ah no, e questo è la vecchia versione di
Okay, so if we can get this first session in this room going, this session is on the Italian left in the Cold War beyond anti-Americanism. We have three speakers. One of the speakers, as some of you may know, has not been able to make it, Valentin Romellini. So we'll have three speakers, and that means at least we have time not to rush our speakers or indeed the discussants or the questions afterwards. So I'll just kick off straight away with our first speaker, who is Andrea Guiso, in the middle here. Andrea is a researcher, ricercatore at the University of Rome La Sapienza, where he teaches contemporary history. He's written extensively on the history of communism, political and institutional history of contemporary Italy, and comparative history. And I'll just quote the first of the list of publications that he provided for me: La colomba e la spada, lotta per la pace e anti-americanismo nella politica del PC, dal 49 al 54, which seems one of several very pertinent publications for the presentation today. So Andrea's paper is entitled Anti-Americanism in the PC's Political Culture.
Many thanks, Robert. First of all, let me thank the Department of POLIS and the organizer of the conference for the welcome invitation to discuss about foreign policy and the left in Italy. The topic I'm dealing with today, the anti-Americanism of the Communist Party, is undoubtedly a central aspect of this issue. So much so that in recent years have attracted the curiosity of a growing number of researchers interested in exploring links between domestic politics and international politics. But it would be an understatement, as the literature teaches us, consider the anti-American discourse only by an angle of history of power and international relations. It is through this particular narrative, in fact, that express themselves from the late 19th century, especially in Europe, anxieties and fears about the fate of own civilization, anxieties towards modernity, where, quoting Marx, everything seems to contain within itself the seed of its opposite. America, then, as a mirror in which are reflected all the potential dichotomies of modern social experience, democracy and anonymous power of the equipment, equality and discrimination, exaltation of the man and social uniformity, liberation from needs and slavery of mass. If anti-Americanism is a discourse about modernity, it is not difficult to understand why the attitude of the Communist Party towards the United States is characterized since Second World War through a structural ambivalence in which seem coexist repulsion and attraction. Of course, if we move from languages and representations towards more concrete political level, things appear in a different light. Anti-Americanism, in this case, namely how organized mobilization against political, economic, and military domination of the United States, is a typical product of the Cold War. Moreover, it is a specific product of Clausewitian culture of politics, largely dominant in the international communist movement. We can define this as the first paradigm of anti-Americanism in the political culture of the Communist Party. From one point of view, it would not even make sense to call it anti-Americanism almost, if not in reference to the prominent role that the United States takes since 1947 in the process of economic, political, military, integration of the West. It is hardly necessary to point out how, in fact, until 1946, Britain and not the United States represent in the eyes of the Soviet the expression of capitalism in its most advanced expansionism. The main features of the discourse and the activist anti-American, if we use a long-term approach, are thus essentially a product of anti-imperialism as a doctrine, culture, and practice of international politics of the Soviet state in the era of total war. The struggle for peace under the guidance of the Comintern aimed to counteract political, economic, and military integration between Europe and the United States is not, in fact, an outgrowth of a sudden in the history of communism. Since the time of the committee Amsterdam Pleyel, William Bunzenberg at the end of the 20s, it represents a specific instrument of the Soviet power politics in Europe. Therefore, more correct to speak about an unorganized anti-Americanism, functional to the dynamic environment of the Cold War and the possible conversion of the mass party in the action of the party of civil war. And this is the sense of the dramatic indications from Palmiro Togliatti to executive board members and members of the Central Committee in March 1949, campaign against the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or the one against nuclear weapons in 1950, Appeal of Stockholm, perfectly summarize this logic of reversibility of the struggle for peace in the years of Stalinism. The war thinking and the tragic concept of politics based on the link war-revolution, a loop that will open in 1914 and that leaders of international communism do not yet out, there are the backbone and the inescapable foundation. However, while on the political sphere the enemy is clearly identified in Communist Party propaganda, communism and Americanism appear to be linked by a ratio of close inbreeding. America for communism of 30s, 50s is indeed an enemy, but also a model of modernization that you believe you can reach and overtake, amending from its original scene. For over a decade, organized anti-Americanism of the period 1949-1954 until the campaign against the European defense community will constitute a stable acquisition of the international communist movement. But at the end of the decade 60s, everything is called into discussion. For the PSI, 60s represent an age of conversion, marked by a profound change in the political culture of the party. There are three aspects of this passage: the gradual emancipation of the party from a tragic conception of politics, of the Leninist mold, past a vision of international relations based on the notion of international civil war, the crisis of secularization of communism, and the consequent weakening of the political and ideological bond between USSR and Brothers Party. Within this new framework, the PSI accrue the belief that they can take on their own the international strategy without renounce to the ideal reasons of communism as a global revolution. It will be the idea of Europe, but in a neutralist and anti-American way, to perform in the 70s an increasingly important role in order to preserve this core constitutive of communist identity. The old paradigm of anti-American one is so completely overthrown to the absence of the ruling against NATO, matched by a fundamentalist and moral critic of the Western civilization and American in particular. a critic which incorporates motives and typical atmosphere of cultural pessimism and the thought of the crisis of fin de siècle. The turning point is represented by 1971-1973, suspension of Bretton Woods, oil shocks, stagflation. In this complex political and economic scenario, the PSI of Berlinguer begins to theorize a political action capable of giving shape to a new model of democracy in Italy and Europe, prefiguring the overcoming of the logic of blocks and the radical transformation of Western society in socialist direction. These issues are, however, developed from a cultural background of longer gestation, dating back to the 60s and to the comparison between the communists, secularists, and Catholic gained against the backdrop of the Vietnam War and the anti-imperialist mobilization in those years. It is not too much to say that the new anti-American paradigm is born by osmosis through the dialogue of the Communist Party with the current, with political and social current, Catholic in the first place, the most critical of Western modernization. They are seeds, we must have, that will have no difficulty taking root in a party whose political culture continues, except for a political intellectual minority, the line Amendola Napolitano, to be marked by a catastrophic vision of capitalism. The dual note of the PC to the deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe and the birth of the EMS is the son of a logic that does not have more points of contact with the old anti-Atlanticism. No less is revealing of a hard ideological arrière-pensée about perspective of Europe. The interpretation of the Euro-Atlantic relations in the day of crisis of civilization have come to obscure systemic nature of ties between Europe and the United States, the ephemeral nature of the concept of European civil power, in the context, again, critical of the Second World War. The nature of the reform processes of economic and financial institutions and the relationships between state and market in Europe. The 80s are, from this point of view, the hardest moment of confrontation in the Communist Party between idealism and realism, between instances of palingenesis and reforming thinking, between the anti-Westernism deeply rooted in the peace movement during the period 1983-84, in which the Communist Party and the youth communists are completely immersed, and opening up to the great theme of strategic integration between Europe and the United States. In conclusion, I think that would have been great appeals of 1989, 1991 to change the PCI more than the PCI was not really willing to do. The parliamentary debate on the Gulf War was, in a sense, the test, as evidence of the willingness always present, even in the years of the Communist Party, to bring anti-Americanism to the European identity. A deep cultural drift, as we have seen, destined to survive in new forms, new different forms, to the crisis and the transformation of the Italian Communist Party. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we'll move straight on to take all three papers and then the discussion will follow. So our second speaker is Martin Maestricht. Martin is a PhD candidate at the Institute of International Studies at Charles University in Prague, where he also studied for his MA. He studied political science at Bologna University. His principal research interests are Italian politics, and political science with an emphasis on the Italian left. He also works on current populist movements in Europe, coping with the crisis. His paper today is entitled, "Are We Anti-Americans or Not? Italian Communist Party and its Internal Struggle About Foreign Policy."
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be here to discuss my paper with you. I will focus more on the development of intra-party opinion currents inside the Italian Communist Party regarding their position towards foreign policy, towards their relationship to the United States. I chose to describe these groups like opinion currents because of the two main reasons. One is that to distinguish them from like these classic political currents and factions described by, for example, Giovanni Sartori or Arturo Colombo at the beginning of '70s, like these typical groups inside Italian political parties during the First Republic, especially in Christian Democrats and socialists, like these power brokers inside the party model. So to distinguish this kind of different model of party group, I decided to call it like opinion currents, not just only faction or currents. And the second reason is that even Italian communists themselves forbade using this denomination faction or political current in their statutes in 1956, when they really literally said that it wouldn't be possible to practically have another opinion than the official one of the party secretary. That's why I'm operating with this term political opinion current to show differences and specificity of this group inside the Italian Communist Party. So we can say that it doesn't mean that the party was also from the very beginning like the unified body with only one official opinion on all subjects, especially foreign policy. It was quite on contrary, and I will show that the role of these opinion currents on the party development was very crucial, and one of the most contested issues of these currents was in fact the question of foreign policy and how to cope with this anti-Americanism and how to cope with position towards the West during the Cold War. So we can describe, or we can see 4 different periods of this development of party opinion currents in the Italian Communist Party. The first one was quite described in the last Andrea's contribution, that it was this first post-war period of the party under the leadership of Palmiro Togliatti, who really constructed quite a rigid and very autocratic leadership, where it was quite hard to pursue any autonomous position, especially regarding foreign policy, because we must consider it was the beginning of Cold War and all of this emerging pressure from the United States on other Western European countries to stabilize the political situation in Italy and to maybe we can say also hegemonize the political and cultural space in the Italian politics, contributed to this reaction of Italian communists. They reacted like with this strong critique and defense of these true Italian values against the United States, depicted as this arrogant, naive imperialism who wanted to impose their own rules, their own culture vision to Italian people. Many authors are directly saying that Italy was like the most Americanized nation in the whole Europe regarding this influence exercised by the United States and their political and cultural institutions. So in this first period, the party was quite united in this voice regarding this fight against all American things, on the cultural level, like against American books, against American literature, movies, all of this culture stuff, and on the other hand, also on the political level where the party opposed by demonstrations or proclamations, obviously, the foreign policy of the United States, like Korean War or establishing of the NATO and all of these major international events of the 1950s. But this phase kind of diminished at the beginning of 1960s when mentioned discussion about how to proceed with capitalism started to grow inside the Italian Communist Party, because many of these leaders realized that it's impossible to overthrow or to change this capitalist model of Italy to establish some new kind of like Soviet model of politics and economy in Italy, and that's why they tried to understand how they can proceed in their modification or influencing of this capitalist model in Italy. And this was like the base of emerging of these opinion currents. One of them was formed by mentioned Giorgio Napolitano, and more by Giorgio Amendola, is called miglioristi, which means like improvers of the situation. We can call it like the most reformed group of the party, which wanted to transform this party more towards the socialist model of perceiving not only political but also economic things. And on the other hand, there was this group formed by Pietro Ingrao, more focused on this traditional approach towards not only just capitalism, but also like towards this culture and political identity of the Communist Party, more related to party base, to party this culture and educational function of the party. You can say it like that. But in that period, in the second period during the 1960s, it wasn't foreign policy like this key problem between these two emerging opinion currents. This came only in the third phase, which can be connected with the invasion of Soviet troops to Czechoslovakia in 1968, when Italian communists for the first time criticized openly the Soviet foreign policy as something not so good, not only for obviously for the world peace, but also for them as in the internal situation in Italy. And also not only for this event, the importance of foreign policy was considered the key issue, but also for the new Secretary General of the party, Enrico Berlinguer. He came at the beginning of 1970s with his, that time, very innovative, a very modernist approach of famous historical compromise. In 1973, he wrote this famous article reacting to the coup d'etat in Chile, in which he described and he called for this new historical compromise, to new approach to opening on the domestic base to the other political parties, as was mentioned, especially obviously for Christian Democrats, and on the international level to more cooperation with other left European parties, and more in general with other with West European countries. So this functioned like the trigger for these opinion currents also to discuss their approach to foreign policy, because it was obvious that the party had to take some position in international work, and towards the United States and also towards the Soviet Union, and these currents took this position that, for example, which were very, very different. Pietro Ingrao's group came with this we can call it maximalist vision of how to cope with foreign policy. They proposed to overcome the ideology of two of these two Cold War blocs and to create something like alternative model to American capitalism, but also to Soviet model of communism. For example, his close collaborator Chano Barca came with this proposal to perceive this mode of planned economy, but different from the Soviet model. He didn't continue with this description, but he had this idea. And for example, on the other hand, there was this improvers group of Giorgio Napolitano and Giorgio Amendola who refused this approach, like more over ambitious and non-realistic, and came with so-called realistic approach, which wanted to start negotiations between these two Cold War blocs, but with very important thing that they understood that Italy was part of the Western world. This couldn't be changed, and that's why there must be the negotiation between these two blocs, and they can contribute it from the part of the member of NATO and part of the West. And the important thing is that Enrico Berlinguer, the party secretary, decided after long discussion and long balance between these two forces to side with this maximalist approach of Ingrao, and this was like the base of his famous declaration of Eurocommunism, which meant like this alternative way how to march towards socialism, on this new way how to approach not only domestic affairs but also the international affairs of foreign policy. So this new direction obviously was criticized from outside by the Soviet Union, because for them was kind of heresy of their official policy, but also was kind of criticized from inside the party, where obviously this improvers group of Napolitano criticized it for being so weak against the Soviet Union, and for being so undescribed, so not well defined as on the ideological grounds. And ironically, the other critiques of this Eurocommunist approach was new emerged small opinion current created by Armando Cossutta, who was like the most orthodox, most dogmatic politicians inside the Italian Communist Party, who criticized this Eurocommunist approach on absolutely different reasons, because for them, for this opinion current, the situation, because they were absolutely loyal to the Soviet Union, the situation for them was like the heresy of the Soviet political doctrine. So at the beginning, it was seen that this historical compromise of Berlinguer functioned, because the party obtained in 1976, as you know, the biggest result in their history, and the party leadership was kind of positive about the possibility to overcome also the dominance of the Christian Democrats. But on the other hand, especially because of Berlinguer's, you can say, shocking words about feeling safer on the side of NATO, this famous interview 1 week before elections on those pages of Corriere della Sera. So this try to appeal to more center voters backfired inside the party, where the growing opposition against this leaving of thoughts, this traditional left-wing thoughts, was kind of apparent, and also the party base was kind of disappointed during this period of so-called national emergency from 1978-79, where the Italian Communist Party backed the monopoly government of Giulio Andreotti, and this helped the critic inside the party to criticize Berlinguer and his approach as not helping to the party. And this was quite obvious after the next election, 1979, where the party lost 4%, which was in that time perceived like big loss, and after that Berlinguer decided to announce the historical compromise as a failure, but and came with this democratic alternative, which was like new approach of the cooperation of all, not only left but all political parties in Italian politics, which was perceived more as the defeat of this right-wing militaristic, right-wing improvers current, but on the other hand was also in direct opposition to Ingrau's current, because he always wanted this approach of the cooperation of all only left-wing political parties. So this was ended during 1980s when Berlinguer created this very strong party center and some kind of marginalized all of these opinion currents and created some kind of, again, unified body of the party and calmed down the situation. But this ended with his premature death in 1984, when these opinion currents emerged again and started with this last stage of their development during 1980s, where started to fight each other quite openly in their struggle about party future, which was, as Andreas said, which was quite illustrative case when the Gulf War started in 1990, when the party was so divided, and for the first time also on the parliamentary level, when large part of their deputies refused to listen to the official party instruction to vote for the deployment of Italian troops in Iraq, and rebelled against the party. I can conclude with the statement that after the party was subduing their transformation in 1990, 1991, these opinion currents played some kind of big role in the sense that they really divided the party between, we can say, the cleavage like we and them, so we as the supporters and them as the opposers of the transformation, and there was quite a big fear that the party collapsed and will be split into very different halves, which didn't happen, because at the last 20th Congress in 1991, only one small group of Armando Cossutta left the party, which was seen like the big success, that only this very small dogmatic group left the party. But as we can maybe also discuss, that the further development of the party wasn't that the transferred new PD, post-communist PDS emerged unified with no existence of this opinion current. It was quite a contrary, that this opinion current, which struggled during the whole party history, continued to struggle also after the transformation, and it was visible also, and in my opinion, also one of the reasons when the party didn't succeed in their propositions in the transition period from the first to the second Italian Republic, and it was also one of the main reasons why the party lost the elections, surprisingly the elections in 1994, and we can say that this liability of the party, not so fully transformed party structure, we can see also today in current Democratic Party. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martin. So we'll move on to our last presentation by Marzia Maccaferri. Marzia is currently visiting fellow at the Institute of Historical Research in London. She received her PhD in history from Bologna and is held teaching and visiting research positions at the University of Modena, Reggio Emilia, Goldsmiths, and LSE. Her research interests range across transnational and comparative European history, in particular the theory and history of the intellectual and political narratives during the post-World War II period in Europe. She's currently working on Anglo-Italian cultural relations through the perspective of the concepts of reference culture and ideological translation as a way to approach intellectual and political dimensions, focusing on how intellectuals looked respectively at the English and Italian examples as models for cultural and political reforms. I'll just mention a forthcoming publication between Empire and Europe, Intellectuals and the Nation in Britain and France during the Cold War. And Matthew's paper today is entitled Left-Wing Intellectual Discourse and Foreign Policy, 1950s and 1960s.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Well, I'll try to be as condensed as possible, but I'm not sure I'll be able to do it, so please cut me when it's done. Okay, the theme of the public intellectual is central for Italian historiography and Italian critical studies. Recent historiography has been attentive to the events concerning the intellectual groups and their dynamics. However, the categories of impegno and patronage and the weird intellectual nation identity are still the main path along which to develop the Italian intellectual discourse. In other terms, this paper is born from a dissatisfaction with a historiographic debate, my dissatisfaction, that insists on fencing in the theme of left-wing intellectual within the frame of the link between party, political party, and intellectuals, and consider the intellectual discourse mainly through the lens of organization of culture. The consequence of this, I argue, that this debate continues to pose what I believe is a false question. I mean, the disappearance of the intellectual, nowadays disappearance of the intellectual, or at least the real one. See, for example, the special issue of Mega last year. This debate, which has by now given rise a sort of literary subgen, is acting as a litmus test for evaluating the state of the nation and the extent of the Italy's deficits. Starting from here, I think that it is intriguing to an understanding of how discourse meets foreign policy. It's an intriguing perspective from which to start to escape the burden of national intellectual discourse. Well, as regards the terminus of quo, I will place the stabilization of democratic policy. Starting from the 50s, all political and intellectual actors reached a shared, although undeclared, acceptance of what would brilliantly be described as bipartitismo imperfetto, This subphase of Italian foreign policy is matched by the contemporary and parallel unfolding of an intellectual generation. And I will finish with the publication of La Politica Estera della Repubblica Italiana in 1967, by the Istituto Affari Internazionali. Here, in the subsequent publication, Inchiesta sulla Politica Estera Italiana of the 70s, the various authors sanctioned the definitive transition to a phase in which the dimension of foreign policy, international relations, and their respective narratives became the national politics. Okay, I can skip all of this. Well, for Italian left-wing intellectuals, the discovery of foreign policy was a gradual as well as laborious process. In this paper, I shall list some passages of in this debate without claiming to be exhaustive. The choice of this intervention does not wish to be an intellectual history of international thinking. On the contrary, I wish to ask how the international relation system and that of foreign policy analysis have entered a conversation with left-wing intellectual discourse in a fundamental historical phase both for the Republic and for the Italian cultural system, and how they, the intellectual, use foreign policy as a potential political and cultural tool. Okay, what are the main arguments? Europe, of course. The prospect of the European Union offered the chance to the left to step into the debate with cultural as well as political arguments. Among the intellectuals who follow this option, there are I will follow Il Ponte, just a quick reference, and Altiero Spinelli during his years at Bologna, the Associazione, when he was involved on Il Mulino with the Associazione Culturale Mulino, and when he was visiting professor at the Johnson. Okay, for Il Ponte, for example, in Europe, Italy could have found an instrument to emerge from passiveness, subordination to the strategy of the great powers, and it can also grasp the opportunity to enhance the international defense, to put themselves forward as an international actor, also in terms of passiveness. While the search for a third force was explicitly born as a reaction, of course, the renewal of Italy in Europe had to do with the culture politics link. This is the theme that in those same years, Bobbio, for example, was elaborating, and that found its own complete exposition in Politica e Cultura, 1955. On Il Ponte, Bobbio renders for a larger audience what he had elaborated for the Rivista di Filosofia. In the confrontation between La Trahison de Klerk and the Gramscian organic intellectual, Bobbio advances the juxtaposition between cultural politics and political culture, and the leadership of European liberalism, capable of exalting the moment of civil society in respect to that of the state. It is a liberal tradition, nonetheless, that presents some anomaly, because it looks at both socialism, following the first step of Savigny and Rosselli, and communism, following the indication of the Greek. In the frame of the coming to terms with the Italian tradition that this new generation of post-Second World War intellectuals decided to undertake, and led by Bobbio's reflection, the main importance is taken on by the overcoming of idealism, of course, on the one hand, and the inevitable confrontation with Croce and historicism, and on the other, the opening toward the new social sciences. Some of the key passages of this path can be identified in Spinelli's years in Bologna. This is a phase in the 60s, actually. This is a phase little studied in Spinelli's biography, which is strictly Spinelli biography, guided by a radical federalist orthodoxy, within which this choice to withdraw to his studio and to teaching struggled to be understood. A season, however, that saw him abandon the European federalist movement was coming close to socialists, to the Italian Socialist Party and the other European Socialist Party, identified by him as the new political instrument supporting the pro-European action and to welcoming the community option for the construction of Europe. For Spinelli, for Spinelli, the time has thus come to rethink socialism beyond merely national terms. This rethinking, of course, recovers the polemic between socialism and Marxism, from which Spinelli's whole political adventure in the 30s has started, gathering the mainstream narrative of the end of the ideology and putting itself positively vis-à-vis the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The arena that Spinelli chose to officialize, the community choice, and the left-wing turnaround was the essay titled Al di là del mercato comune, Beyond the Common Market, published in the April 1962 issue of Il Mulino, an issue wholly dedicated to the European Economic Community. The common market in this essay has proven, Spinelli recognized, to be a very important step in the European project, as it has, this is a quotation, shattered the myth of the unshakable national economic interest. And so the time had come for the European democratic left to regain her political manifesto. It is the new frontier of European democracy. Okay, I'm going quite well. Spinelli will return to his pro-European within a short time. First, by founding Istituto Affari Internazionali in October 1965, decreasing his commitment to Mulino and returning to his political career first in the European Commission and later in Parliament. It will be in the Istituto Affari Internazionali that Spinelli will channel with the forefront creation of a think tank whose main objective is to promote an understanding of the problems of international politics, in which social science were the pillar, so which organize all the work and all the work. The theme of the intellectual and international politics was the theme, the core argument of Charles Frankel essay in the first issue of the Spettatore Internazionale, and was the heart of two round tables that the Institute for International Affairs organized in 1967. Acknowledging the international transformation that had occurred, nuclear clash between democratic countries and communist countries, between nationalism and supranationalism, and acknowledging the fact that the history of the relation between culture and foreign policy had yet to be written, we are in 67. The Istituto Affari Internazionali working document on which to start a discussion lays out the traits on what the intellectual was supposed to be for international politics. Probably the point to be resolved here is not the discovery of an educational system, but the discovery of the new methods by means of which the intellectual can oblige the politician to take their ideas into account. Once the main way was that of the party. Today the party is increasingly just an electoral machine. Only if we manage to find some indication in this sense can we draw intelligence and energy into the problem of internal politics. Okay, I will try to make some final points. The historiography of Italy foreign policy is tended towards advanced and rather polarized interpretation. Italy is either seen as a small country ready to override European and global constraints, or as a country with the most unstable political system whose foreign policy suffered from being inescapably dominated by its own domestic problems. In this picture, therefore, the relationship between intellectual history and foreign policy has always remained a marginal element. As this paper has attempted to show, however, the link between foreign policy and culture seems to be a perspective for understanding the history of Italy, capable of emerging from an exclusively national and strictly domestic approach. The discovery of foreign policy analysis as a potential political culture instrument has the function, in association with other debates such as the analysis of neo-capitalism or the analysis of the African society, as the function of deprovincializing Italian culture and making it emerge from the autarkic self-sufficiency that is still shown in the 60s. To recall to the use of the social science or sciences also as regards the understanding of the changing condition of the international scenario, then comes with the broader encounter and clash with the Prussian and historicist tradition, and in the sporadic appearance of the Italian neo-Enlightenment. And we can sum up this debate indicated by Bobby as being the relationship between politics and culture. Starting from this point, if we introduce the subfield of foreign policy, then also the European question becomes a place where to experience the change and the cultural modernization that is at the top place in the agenda of the left intellectual discourse. The slow discovery of foreign policy as an aspect of cultural dialectic is matched by the parallel process of renewal and rethinking of democratic European society. We may wonder why, starting from this perspective, no reference has had to be made to the events of 1956, commonly referred as the key moment for the left-wing intellectual discourse. For the Italian case, it was an event revealing longer-term phenomena and in which the international scenario served as a detonator. Let's take the example of the journal Ragionamenti and the Passato Presente and the group of critical Marxists, tied to them, Raniero Panzieri, Franco Fortini, and others. Or the methodic experience of Opinione, it was a small journal founded in Bologna in 1956 by Gianni Scalia, was one of the founders of the Mulino, and starting from 1956, the rebirth of Mondo Operaio. 1956 was the viatico for all this intellectual debate for re-establishing a credible autonomy of culture. But this would only occur in the frame of the plastic for some, as Panzieri and others, or in the adhesion to a model of engagement that reflected obsessively upon itself, and that would later lead the birth of operaismo and modernism. In short, the search for a new conceptual and interpretative instrument turned upon itself. That's my hypothesis. Bringing the analysis to the inside and forgetting the global picture. Okay, the fluid relationship between the theme of Europe and the left, as well as I have put the Anglophilia, that's another theme that I mentioned in the paper, but not here, would later explode in different forms, from a Eurocommunism and to the debate of electoral reform and that. I try to summarize just some steps of this this part. In this paper, I have closed to how foreign policy interacted with intellectual discourse, how certain aspects became predominant as opposed to others. As a further step, if I may conclude in terms of future research, will be to question how this discourse interrelates with strategy and context in order to generate practice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Matteo. And to all our panelists. We now have, very pleased to say, as a discussant, Mark Gilbert. So, Mark, do you perhaps Okay, so yes, Mark Gilbert is our discussant. Mark Gilbert, as I'm sure many of you will know, is Professor of History and International Studies at the Johns Hopkins Bologna Centre. Before coming to Bologna, Mark was Associate Professor in Contemporary History and International Studies at Trento, and before that at Bath, and he began his career at Dickinson College. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. I'll just cite a couple of publications that might be relevant here. European Integration, A Concise History, Historical Dictionary of Modern Italy as co-author, 2007, Surpassing Realism, The Politics of European Integration since 1945, and so on. So I'll hand over to Mark as discussant, and then we'll hopefully have plenty of time for open questions afterwards.
Is your chair?
No, I'm going to sit there, don't worry.
Right, well, given that we're talking about Altiero Spinelli and the Bologna Centre, I thought I'd fill my Bologna Centre time. Okay, I'll make some general comments and then turn to the individual papers. I'm not going to be making critical comments here because I think they were very interesting and wide-ranging body of papers, except for one minor point. I thought that everybody tried to bite off more than they could chew, with the exception of Valentine, who's not here, who perhaps didn't chew enough. And I'll be very happy to talk about individual comments with the papers later. I just thought I'd make some general comments. Starting point, a general comment that comes through from these papers very clearly, is the impossibility of separating, at any rate when you're talking about left-wing parties or left-wing intellectuals in Italy, the domestic from the international. This comes across very strongly. Debates in the domestic sphere spilled over into the international sphere, the perception that they had of the international sphere influenced the domestic sphere, and so on. Second point, which came across to me, and just talking about the PCI now for a moment, was that the foreign policy of the PCI became, I was going to say, I actually wrote in my notes here, more autonomous, but autonomous is the wrong word, I think. It became part of a wider debate. And I think a general comment that I would make, and became in the 60s and 70s, became part of a wider debate about how Europe could be reshaped beyond the Cold War juxtaposition. And in this respect, I would make a little comment to all the panelists here about focusing not too much, but looking outside the debate within the Italian Communist Party itself, and looking outside of the debate that was going on in the rest of Europe. I think, for example, and this is purely me improvising because I don't know, but I think logically, someone like Olof Palme must have been extremely influential in many of the debates that you were talking about. And I think it's interesting to look in the Prague Spring. If you look at the action plan of the Communist Party in 1968, and the people like Jimmy Hayek, I think you can see this influence, or the influence of French liberal socialists, or people like Claude Julien. And I think you can see all kinds of influences from outside, and the way in which the Communist Party in Italy was being influenced by non-Moscow sources to revive and rethink its approach. And I actually think Spinelli, presumably, is one of these influences. No? That's a question I've got for you later. Now, another point which comes up, look at just general points when I'm looking at the different papers, is certainly the PCI, as a good Marxist party, was really trying to change the world rather than interpret it. But actually, what they actually succeed in doing is interpret it, or have it interpret themselves. Because, you know, all the papers are ultimately about intellectuals or political leaders. And as there's a very interesting recent book being published in French by a guy called Frédéric Attal, which is like a sociology of intellectuals in Italy. He divides intellectuals in Italy between intellectuel éducateur and intellectuel expert. And he argues that in Italy, the technical experts, the tecnici, are the ones who have prevailed. The intellectuals have been immersed in politics. No? And I think this comes through in these papers. We see intellectuals who are involved in politics trying to interpret the world and thinking they're changing it. This would be the point of that. They think that what they're doing is extremely historically significant because they're rethinking the way the left should be in the world. And as a result, their political action follows on from the debates which are taking place within the PCI in particular. At any rate, this is what I got from the paper, is based on who's got the correct reading of history and which line is therefore correct for us to follow. I don't know if this makes sense to anybody, but this is something I got from the paper, and it's something I also got when I was reading, something I also extracted when I was reading Lucio Magri's Il Sarto di Un, for example, which is a book which I think is well worth reading in the context of the papers that you were doing. Now, when you look at it all this, so what was this reading? What was this reading that the Communist Party had of its role in the changing world, the changing Cold War world? I think Andrea makes this point very well in his paper. He quotes a long memoir sent to Berlinguer by Antonio Tato. And it says, if we Italian communists, with our policy of broad unity in our country and in Europe, can set in motion a change in the direction of socialism in our society and the capitalist West, we will begin a process that can also have an impact that will actually reach the world. No? So they thought what they were doing was of world historical significance. Eurocommunism, the reaching out, trying to imagine how the third world, the anti-Americanism you're talking about, is of world historical significance. And this was something which in Valentine Lomellini's paper, she's not here, but I think she would benefit from the other papers that we've heard today, because her argument is the PCI over-interpreted signs of interest on the part of Washington, and in particular university intellectuals in the United States, because of their self-referentiality. And I couldn't, to be honest, figure out what she was getting at. Having read the other papers, I now see what she means, because the self-referentiality she's referring to is the PCI feeling it's at the centre of a radical change in the structure and organisation of the Cold War world, and is therefore extraordinarily important. So of course the Americans should be reaching out to us. Well, of course the Americans couldn't give stuff. Let's say it's not completely true, but certainly not all Americans were really concerned and didn't want to take a massive step of changing their Cold War policy in order to encompass the PCI. So this is just the general point which I've made, got from reading this. And so I suppose my question to Matteo would be, you talked a lot about Spinelli, and I suppose my question to you would be, you talked a lot about Spinelli, but you didn't talk very much about the extent to which Spinelli altered the train of discourse in, I mean, to what extent is Spinelli's perception of himself as a world historical individual, because I think he really has this very strong, I mean, he really has a complete concept of himself as somebody who's changing the universe. I mean, to what extent does Spinelli's notion of a changing world influence this debate that's going on inside the Communist Party? And more broadly speaking, question mark, I don't know, I didn't get this from your paper, but he's talking about, you know, he says the DC, I can't remember the quote now, the DC and the PSI are immobile, they're useless. We can give a real soul to Italian policy by turning the world into a federalist direction of a socialist Europe. That's the essence of it. Yeah? I mean, to what extent does that influence the PCI's debate? Question mark. I mean, I don't know if you can answer that question, but it struck me because there's a way of linking the papers. And I suppose, for Andrea, I mean, just coming back to this, question mark, to what extent was this debate that was going on within the Communist Party in the 1970s, to what extent, which I think you define very well about the anti-Americanism as being a functioning of its evolving worldview, to what extent is it informed by external debate? To what extent are they conscious of themselves as being part of a wider debate about the nature of the changing politics of Cold War Europe? Question mark. And then just coming on to Martin. No? I thought your discussion of how you pass from Amendola to Ingrao, I think the question which struck me about your paper was the extent to which there's overlapping. Okay, so you start out with a juxtaposition of Amendola and Ingrao. Amendola chiaramente, it leads on to in foreign policy the discussion of the miglioristi, and then you have Amendola and Ingrao, and their different notions of trying to interpret how to make progress for the Communist Party within Italian capitalism. And then you shift into a discussion of international foreign policy, and you set up a notion of the maximalists, led by Pietro Ingrao, trying to go beyond the blocks. The miglioristi, the realists, trying to work within the blocks and to make the PCI a force which is taken seriously at an international level. And then I would add the orthodox bloc, the Brezhnevites, led by Kossuth, and we'll leave those aside. Berlinguer, you argue, and I think it's very interesting, though, in effect takes, in domestic policy, and essentially, I suppose you could call it a realist line or a migliorist, in the sense that he tries to cooperate with the existing forces, but in international politics, he tries to go beyond the blocks. No? So my question to you is, to what extent, and this was the question that really struck me reading your paper, was structure and agency. To what extent is Berlinguer a really key individual who imposed a vision of the world onto that party, as opposed to somebody who was led in that direction by the prior choices of the party? Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Can I suggest, if it's okay, if you hold on to the specific questions on your paper, perhaps till the end, or anyway, for a few minutes, so we can give the floor a chance to respond to the general points that Mark was making, and also to the papers as well, and then perhaps the cumulative address to each speaker can come in at the end in a response, if that's going to work. Yeah, is that okay? Okay. So thanks very much. Yeah, can I open the floor to questions? Yeah. First, you then.
Yes. Yes, for identifying ourselves, Jason Davidson, University of Mary Washington. I'm curious, something that I'm interested in both in the contemporary setting but also dating to the 50s and 60s is what we mean by anti-Americanism. So to what extent is anti-Americanism about opposition to specific policies. So say in 2003, 2004, everybody was talking about anti-Americanism in Italy. What they really meant was opposition to Bush's Iraq policy, which is not anti-Americanism. Or are we talking about opposition to aspects of the American political or economic system? Or are we really talking about something that is more global even than that? More fundamental than that? Because even if we talk about aspects of the American economic or political system, you can find plenty of either American political figures or Americans who are also critical of aspects of our economic and political system. So I'm curious, in terms of, I know your focus is on the 50s and 60s, but what does anti-Americanism mean to the individuals involved in those debates? What does it encompass? Is it politics and policy? Is it system? Is it culture? And I heard a variety of those things in terms of the presentation.
Okay, thanks. Let's take a couple and then.
Yeah.
Did you want to?
I actually had. I'll try to make them brief. Sort of a question, probably for Matteo and Andrea. One follows on from actually Mark's comments about, the extent to which it really is impossible to kind of separate the domestic and the international in the case of Italy, because it's kind of like a ping pong. It kind of goes back and forth. At the same time, I wanted to ask Matteo to just sort of clarify and push the point that she was making. So I think it's really interesting what you said about Spinelli in Europe. So Europe gave the chance, to left-wing intellectuals to join the debate, to really emancipate themselves from the kind of isolation. But then it became an internal debate. And this is really interesting. And it lost the context. It lost the kind of awareness of an international context. And I think, so the extent to which the domestic and the international relate to each other is true throughout the Cold War, except that there are periods in which there's an isolation of that debate from the global context. One question for Andrea, and I really liked your paper, and we were talking about this yesterday. Really interesting that during the Cold War and during the 50s, I think one key question, which is the issue of the use of force. I mean, to me, it sounds like, one really, really important question, and we see the relevance of that today in a negative, mostly a negative sense, the taboo, about the use of force. That gets re-articulated in 1956, around the kind of mid-50s, and I was wondering if you wanted to say something a little bit about that. And then the last question was just that I was rereading a piece by Perry Anderson in, not the recent one, the one in 2009, about the invertebrate left, right? And essentially his big argument was that during the Cold War, the left was only left with, sorry for the pun, tactics and not strategy. So sort of, position rather than maneuver. Right, and whether you agreed with that sort of, big sort of an overarching claim.
Okay, should we take one more from the floor and then give a chance to respond to these various points? Chris, sorry, Chris, do you want to?
Just picking up the point about anti-Americanism, I think anti-anything can range from sheer prejudice to a failure to give the benefit of the doubt to a particular target, to a belief that structural forces are pushing your interests, are damaging your interests through the agency of a particular person, in this case the American superpower. It's not surprising. What more interesting in the case of Italy, in that context, it seems to me, in the Cold War, is somebody mentioned that, I forget whether it was there or not, the kind of tension about anti-Americanism within Italy, given that obviously the United States had a profound cultural influence on Italy with Reconstruction in the 50s and so on, and manifestations of cultural pro-Americanism in lots of ways. And it doesn't seem to come out quite, the conflict doesn't seem to come out quite so much in the political context, perhaps because of the dominance of PCI. Whereas in Britain, obviously, the left was deeply conflicted about its relationship, deeply ambivalent anyway about its relationship with the United States.
Well, can I invite, if that's okay, some brief responses from you three, if that's possible, to the various points that have been made. There are other questions I see from the floor, so I don't want this to close up the session, but there's so much for you to deal with. Shall we go in the order? Perhaps Andrea, Martin, Mark, some responses. If you want to.
Thank you, Mark, for your comments and remarks. Mark Weber touched several points and questions very interesting. I try to answer to your question about influence, external influence of PCI. My opinion is that historiography of PCI shows a fundamental misunderstanding deriving from the double nature of this party. Once Luciano Pellicani was the theologian of the libertarian socialism of the Italian Socialist Party, spoke about PCI as Kauskian-Leninist party, a party where coexists aptitude towards social democracy, obviously above all in the sphere of micropolitics, social government or local government, and an attitude towards revolutionary mood. Deeply rooted in its identity on an ideological level, a sort of schizophrenia. American political scientists in 70s believed PCI had complete the road from ideology from policy. They had to change their mind at the beginning of the 80s. Their love for PCI as a de facto social democracy, this is the paradox, didn't return. It's not surprising that the image of America in the 80s assumes demonizing traits. But the sense of this schizophrenia is that on one hand, we have the design, complex political design, which Europe would come to constitute a fundamental pivot. The design took account of a realistic assessment of the changes taking place in the system of international relations. Two were the key points of this analysis. The first was made up of international detent, as a practical result of the dislocation of the blocks and the crisis of the United States and Soviet hegemony on respective zone of influence. Processes that Italian communists did not hesitate to interpret in the wake of Brandt's Ostpolitik as the first crucial step towards overcoming militarist bipolarism. The second was represented instead by the United States decision to suspend the convertibility of the dollar and to drop the international monetary system created by Bretton Woods. Decision dictated, according to the communists, by the willingness of the United States to politically subjugate the old continent, striking at the heart of its production, economic and financial system. The maneuver had instead, always according to the communists, instead sorting uncontrolled and disruptive effects to the global economic order. As evidence of the inherently wild anarchist nature of capitalism. So my answer to no, okay. Now entered in a stage of degenerate dematerialization and financialization. There is an article of Giorgio Amendola, reformist, Anarchia Capitalista, in Rinascita, 23 February 1973. An ideological approach, very, very, very strong.
Okay. Shall we pass on to get everyone a chance?
I
Okay. Firstly, I want to also comment this influence from outside, for non-left, non-Moscow left movements on the Italian politics. Italian politicians, obviously non-communist. I think in my opinion, the most influential period was not only in the 60s or 70s, was at the very end of the party history, before their transformation, because Achille Oketo was seeing how to do this transformation, and he was seeing in all possible directions how to do it, and it was, in my opinion, quite very influenced, particularly by these currents from Prague Spring, because many of these, many of these Czechoslovak intellectuals went to the exile in Italy, Jiří Pelikan, Jiří Hájek, Václav Bělohradský, all of these very influential people, and they obviously through the journalist Luciano Antonetti, they got contact with Italian Communist Party, and they influenced, in my opinion, very heavily to way how to transform. Obviously, the person of Alexander Dubček also, he went to the 18th Party Congress in 1987, and he made this speech to the crowd, in which they mentioned this heritage of Prague Spring and the meaning for the transformation of the Communist Party in Italy, that they must do the transformation according to the ideas of Prague Spring. In my opinion, you're completely right that this influence, especially at the end of the party history, was very influential. Obviously, none of the also perestroika of Gorbachev and all of these foreign influences, but yeah, this was completely true. And to your question about Beringer's role in change in the party leadership, I think in my opinion that the role was very crucial, both on domestic and international level, because he decided by himself to wrote this article to Rinascita in 1972, in which announced this new approach, and he through his collaborators started to interact with Christian Democrats. In my opinion, that was quite his personal role in historical compromise, and he put his own personal effort to do this, to put the Communist Party in the government. But yeah, at the end he had to admit the failure of this. But I think obviously he was balancing all the time between all of these opinion currents. That's why maybe for one time he sided with Amendola, for another time he sided with Ingrao, of the reason of the party majority on the Congress. That's why it's very hard to say that he for the whole time preferred one group before other, and it's very. If you are analyzing this kind of struggle between opinion currents, it's very difficult to say what was the prevailing in one moment, what was the prevailing party group, but we can say generally that the dominant role was always on the part of the party leadership and this dominant group in the center.
Matteo.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Spinelli. Spinelli actually is a sort of religion, and I'm not a big fan of Spinelli. I use Spinelli essay, what Spinelli wrote in the public debate, in the public sphere, to understand the intellectual discourse as a whole. So I don't know if I'm able to reply to the question. To what extent Spinelli influenced the PCI? Well, not in the 60s, of course. It is in the 70s, in the late, when he decided to be, put it in a kind way, a new tool for the PCI in the European Commission. I don't know if Spinelli used the PCI or was the other way around. What I know is that in the European debate, communist leaders, communist intellectuals learn how really is democracy, how really democracy works. It is sure that is with Spinelli that the Italian debate encounter other European debate. In Camille Mulino, he translated a lot of things, and the John Hopkins was another. But it is rather specify and Dibattito di Nicchia. It's a very small for the 60s and the 70s. I used Spinelli here as a part of a more wider debate, and just to understand how the domestic and the international can match together. Lots of context and how Europe was the tool for opening and then became the tool to. I think that 68 is the point. The interpretation of 68, how 68 reshaped the after in 70s reshaped the historiography and the philosophy. It's not just it's the interpretation of a long term of international capitalism. A lot of things, but it's the particular Italian 68, the match between intellectuals and working class travelers. That could be a possible answer.
Shall we ask some more questions? I know Lily had one, and then there's one here, and maybe 2 or 3 more.
Actually, I have a question for Mark as well. So I know you're dealing with a critic space in the paper, but I was curious to know what you thought of the role played by the intellectuals and the relationship between what you call the cultural politics and politics of culture in the crucial years around 1989 to 1991. And building on what Mark just said, so building on what Mark Gilbert commented, would you say that actually those intellectuals close to the PCI were so sort of persuaded of their historical significance that they were so affected by the partisan organizational crisis that suddenly they weren't able anymore to contribute to shape a new partisan political culture? Or I would just be curious to know what you think of these.
Okay, shall we hold up that question and then take a couple more? Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So mine is a question for Andrea, because you mentioned detente at some point, and I was wondering to what extent detente was perceived as a threat to the communist influence in Italy, since most of the PCI public discourse and critique of America was actually based on the issue of disarmament and on presenting America as a world order aggressor obstructing disarmament and peace. So obviously detente meant an appropriation of the debate on disarmament on the part of superpowers. And how does that alter the PCI foreign policy discourse?
Okay, detente. Thank you very much. Perhaps room for one more, and then we'll have some final responses, if there is one. Possibly not. No? Okay, well, let's invite Martin and Andrea.
Okay. Well, again, I'm not an expert on PCI and intellectual. It's again, I think that the link and the relationship didn't work in the crisis because the change before, probably at the end of the 70s. It's just an hypothesis. Yeah, that's it. Sorry, I have to think about it.
We can talk about it later over coffee. That's right.
It was very quick.
We like quick responses.
A short answer. There is a fundamental difference of perspective between European detente and bipolar attempt, PCI, look at the European attempt. It's a crucial step in the evolution of the political culture of the PCI. The turning point is for me, this history has clearly shown, was around 1968 Czechoslovak crisis and the impact of student protests, marked the beginning of profound ideological revision. If we look back at the years of Vietnam War, the anti-Americanism of the Communist Party at this stage remained firmly anchored in the concept of right war. Answer Elizabeth, the legitimacy of the link between violence and politics was still a cornerstone of culture of international politics of the party. As shown, the mission accomplished by Enrico Berlinguer in Hanoi in December 1966, prepared and agreed with Soviets, was fully inserted in this double purpose, anti-imperialism and pro-Soviet. Then, after 1968, we had a turning point in political culture.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've stuck to time. So can we just thank all our speakers and the discussion?
Coffee is outside, finally. Wrap it up.
Thanks very much.